The wind did not whistle here. It pressed softly against the edges of things, moving leaves without sound, carrying a weight more than air. The sky above was not gray, not white, not colored in any way that weather could describe. It simply hung, without depth, without time, like the lid of a box that had forgotten it once opened. Beneath it, the landscape did not change so much as shift, quietly, the way a sleeping body might turn in bed without waking. There were no roads, no markers, no trails, only the ground, the trees, and the space between them that seemed to pulse with the memory of motion. The forest was old, but not in the way that trees usually age. These trees did not grow. They remained. Their roots did not search for water. They remembered where it had once been. Their trunks bore no rings. They were not counting years. They had stopped counting long ago, perhaps even before they were trees. When the wind touched them, they did not sway. They listened. When birds landed, they did not sing. They perched only briefly, and then left. Always in the direction opposite the one you came from, as if retracing something, as if correcting it. Somewhere between the spaces where light couldn't reach, a shape would sometimes appear. Not a person, not a creature, just a pause, standing, waiting, thinking. It held no eyes, yet you felt watched. It cast no shadow, yet you felt smaller in its presence. It never moved, but when you turned again, it was gone. Not vanished, only adjusted. As if memory had edited it out, one breath too late. People said the forest was a boundary, not between places, but between choices. If you entered with a destination, you would never find it. But if you wandered without aim, the forest would offer you places you did not know you had left behind, steps you hadn't taken, turns you had ignored. The path would show itself, but only when you looked away, only when your body faced forward and your heart tilted backward. The first time someone returned from the forest, they spoke of nothing, not silence, but nothing. Their voice came slower, like they had to move through the thick pages of a dream before they could form a word. They walked as if the ground beneath them wasn't where they expected it to be. When asked what they saw, they answered with the kind of smile that doesn't lift the corners of the mouth. Only the eyes. And even those seemed slightly misplaced, as if they had once belonged to someone who had looked the other way. The forest did not welcome footsteps, but it did not resist them either. It simply absorbed them, as if each step was a breath the earth had been waiting to exhale. The leaves underfoot did not crackle. They surrendered, quietly, dissolving into the dirt like words once whispered too often. No matter which way you faced, the trees always looked the same, neither leaning nor upright, neither close nor far. They existed in relation to nothing. A person could walk for hours and feel no distance gained, or pause for seconds and find themselves somewhere they hadn't remembered arriving. At times, the light changed without warning, not the kind of change that came with clouds or passing birds, but the kind that came from memory itself, adjusting the color of a moment. A stone would seem more moss-covered than it had a minute ago. A branch that had broken in half would now be whole again, though still tired from the memory of breaking. You could swear the path was curved when you passed it, and now it was straight. Or was it the other way around? The forest offered no confirmation, only the gentle murmur of something reconfiguring itself around you, always just outside the reach of certainty. In the center of it all, though center was a notion the forest did not obey, there lay a clearing. It wasn't marked by openness, but by the absence of trees that should have been there, like a missing tooth in a smile too old to remember when it had last eaten. In this hollow, the air did not move. Sound did not echo. Time, if it passed through here, must have held its breath. The ground was bare, except for one single line etched faintly across it, like a crease on a forgotten page. It did not stretch far, only a few steps, and then it stopped. But if you looked at it long enough, it seemed to continue, not forward, but behind you. Some said the clearing marked the end of something no one had begun, a thought interrupted before it became an action, a goodbye that was swallowed instead of spoken. Others said it was where people vanished, not in body, but in intent. They returned eventually, but never in the same direction, and never with the same face. The clearing was not a destination. It was a hinge, where memory closed and history refused to open again. One man, years ago, had built a bench beside the clearing, not to sit on but to face away from. He said he never wanted to see what came out of it, only what refused to follow. When he died, the bench remained, weathered, splintered, warped from years of unseen weight. No one ever sat there, and yet the wood bore the shape of someone who always had. The indentation deepened, year by year, as if time remembered someone who had never quite left. And the forest agreed. There was a rhythm to walking here, but it did not come from the body. The feet did not lead, nor did the mind. It was something else, older than instinct, slower than thought. Each footfall seemed to match the beat of something distant, like the echo of a drum played long ago in a place no longer real. The deeper one walked into the trees, the more the outer world faded, not in sound or sight, but in meaning. Memories became quieter. Names held less urgency. Even the weight of time began to loosen its grip, as if untying itself from the spine. Occasionally the ground would change texture without notice. What was once soft moss turned to dry dust, then gravel, then silence itself. Not even the crunch of movement remained, only the suggestion of forward motion. The shadows, too, stopped behaving. They no longer fell opposite the light. Instead, they curved in unnatural ways, bending toward forgotten angles, stretching not from the sun but from choices long buried. One's own shadow, if visible at all, sometimes pointed backward, sometimes disappeared entirely, and there were moments, brief, shivering moments, when two shadows followed instead of one. Some travelers claimed to hear faint whispers in the leaves, but not in words. More like syllables that remembered how to become language, but never quite did. Like breath waiting to become regret. Others felt the forest blink, just once, as if reality closed its eyes, reconsidered, and then opened them slightly askew. Nothing was where it had been, and yet nothing had moved. The path never revealed itself directly. It appeared only in hindsight. You did not follow it. You discovered that you already had. People often spoke of the moment they realized they were no longer walking forward. They had not turned. They had not stopped. And yet the forest ahead looked familiar. Too familiar. Not déjà vu, but repetition. As though the world had recycled itself, stitching together new terrain from the remnants of forgotten steps. That was the signal. That was when you knew. The path had begun, and you had already passed its entrance, without ever seeing it. The first signs were almost imperceptible. A tree with bark peeled in the exact pattern of a place you had once dreamed of. A bird whose shadow didn't match its flight. A ripple in a puddle that did not come from water. These were not illusions. They were reminders. The world gently suggesting you were somewhere you had already been, even if not in body. Footsteps you didn't remember leaving began to appear beside your own. Slight indentations, too shallow for anyone else, yet too precise to be chance. They curved when you curved, paused when you did. Then slowly began to pull ahead. You reached a point where you no longer chose direction. The forest chose for you, not forcefully, not maliciously, but with the quiet insistence of a thought that will not leave. Every fork you encountered narrowed into one. Every hesitation resolved itself without you. Even the light began to behave differently, gathering where you needed to see, withdrawing when you tried to look too far ahead. The horizon was always there, and yet it never approached. You began to sense the path behind you before you understood it. Only when you turned to rest did you see it, thin, deliberate, inevitable, stretching out behind your shoulders like a conclusion drawn too late. No matter how many times you walked it, the path always felt newly remembered, not freshly made, not worn, but recognized, like a phrase on the tip of your tongue, like an apology rehearsed but never delivered. The line it etched through the forest did not cut, it revealed. It did not lead, it mirrored. You walked not to reach anything, but to understand where you had already gone. The path asked no questions. It simply waited for you to notice that it had always been there. That was the cruelty of it. Not its trickery, nor its silence, but its honesty. It never pretended to begin. It only ever ended. And even then, only when you looked back. There was a place, deep within the folds of that forest, where the air grew denser, not heavier, but more filled, as though each breath carried with it fragments of every breath taken before. The light turned amber here, regardless of time. The soil darkened, regardless of season. Moss clung to things that had never lived. Stones bore etchings no hand had carved. The stillness thickened. You did not hear silence. You heard the sound that came before it. A soft, unspoken thing that wrapped around your shoulders and whispered nothing into your ear. People rarely reached this far, and those who did spoke less, not more, as if the vocabulary they returned with had been edited. Their eyes did not widen when they told their stories. They narrowed slightly, as if guarding the details from leaking out. For what they saw was not frightening. It was familiar, uncomfortably so. A curve in the ground that matched the curve of a hallway from childhood. A flickering of shadow that moved exactly like someone long gone. The way the light pooled at the corner of their vision, like the edge of a dream they had mistaken for real life. This was the place where the path ended. Not because it met a wall or a river or a void, but because it no longer needed to continue. It had reached its purpose, not in space, but in awareness. The traveler would turn, slowly, not with intent, but with inevitability. Their eyes would trace the way they came, and only then would the line appear. Not ahead, not beneath, but behind. Clear as truth, sharp as recollection. The path they had walked now shimmered through the trees, whispering, "You were never lost, only unaware." From that final place, most never walked forward again. They stood, they watched, and slowly, they stepped back, retracing what had never been noticed. Each backward step felt strangely new, as though undoing something ancient. The forest did not resist. It shifted again, quietly, remapping itself to allow the journey back. But even in retreat, the path did not vanish. It grew clearer, more defined. It welcomed the reversal, like a door remembering the sound of being closed. And the strange thing, perhaps the saddest, was this. The moment you saw the path, truly saw it, you knew it had been there since the beginning. Every pause, every turn, every fleeting sense of déjà vu. It had all been trying to show you. But we are not taught to look behind. We are taught to aim ahead, to chase, to forget. The forest did not punish. It only waited. And when you were ready, when you were finally willing to look back, it revealed what had always been. A trail, not of direction, but of realization. Some leave tokens here. A coin pressed into bark, a thread tied to a limb, a name whispered into moss. Not to mark the place, but to thank it, for letting them see, for letting them understand that the path had not ended. It had simply waited to begin, the moment they turned around. And so it goes. Each visitor adds their own invisible echo to the forest. Their presence dissolves gently into the memory of the trees. And somewhere, between the moss and the mist, the path watches quietly, not judging, not urging, just waiting for the next pair of eyes to finally look back. The house at the forest's edge had no door. It had once, perhaps, but that was long ago, before it chose to forget how to open. Now it stood quiet, with windows that did not reflect and walls that seemed to absorb color rather than wear it. The paint had long faded into the grain, and the grain had long forgotten its origin. Everything about the house felt slightly unaligned, like a sentence whose words had been rearranged just enough to lose meaning. It did not creak. It did not moan. It merely waited, not for someone to enter, but for someone to remember having done so. No path led directly to it. But somehow, all paths ended here. Grass did not grow toward it, yet the ground seemed flatter near its foundation, as if footsteps had once circled it endlessly. There were no fences, but animals avoided it with such precision that an invisible border remained permanent in the soil. Ivy clung only to the back wall. The front remained untouched, not cleaner, just emptier, the kind of emptiness that has been curated over time. Intentional, reverent, a silence not of absence, but of ritual. Inside, the air was stale in a way that felt personal, not forgotten, but held. Every mote of dust floated with purpose, like suspended memory. Light filtered through in fractured patterns, falling upon surfaces that bore no fingerprints. There was no furniture, only the suggestion of where furniture had once stood, a square of faded floor, a ring in the wooden wall where something had hung, marks of presence without presence. The house did not pretend to be abandoned. It simply remembered a time when it had been lived in, and then chose to remain exactly as it was in that last moment. At the center of the main room was a mirror. It did not reflect the present. It did not reflect at all. Instead, it shimmered faintly, like water just before a ripple, like thought just before a word. Its frame was plain, almost unfinished, and yet its edges were too precise to have been made by hand. No dust touched it. No shadow crossed it. And those who looked directly into it often found nothing. But those who caught its image peripherally, those who dared to glance without meaning to, sometimes saw movement. Not their own, not opposite, but behind. This was where many stopped. Not because they could go no farther, but because they realized they already had. The mirror did not tell the future, nor did it reveal the past. It merely reminded you that you had already seen this place before, perhaps in a dream you thought had been yours, perhaps in a story told to you by someone who no longer remembered your name. The house offered no shelter, only recognition. And for those who stayed long enough to let the silence settle, the path would begin to glow, not ahead, but in the corner of the eye, leading away, softly, into the forest once more. At the back of the house, past the mirror and the remembered furniture, there was a hallway that had no end. It did not stretch far in space, but it never quite concluded. Walking down it was like walking through a sentence missing its last word, unresolved, lingering. The floorboards creaked not with age, but with hesitation. Each step felt borrowed, not earned, like intruding on a life that had already been lived once. The wallpaper peeled in soft curls, revealing nothing behind it but deeper layers of wallpaper, each older, darker, more withdrawn from light. There were no doors along the hallway, only narrow arches that led to nothing. Some opened to blank walls, others to closets too shallow to hold anything larger than a memory. One arch led to a space lit from within by a source you could not see. The light had no direction, it simply was. Standing in that space, a person might feel warmth not on their skin but behind their thoughts, as if a name long forgotten had just been whispered behind them. No sound, just the impression, the ghost of familiarity. At the end of the hallway, that place which was never quite an end, stood a window. It overlooked the forest, though the trees it showed did not match the ones outside. They were stiller, thicker, closer. Their trunks curved in unnatural symmetry, and their branches hung lower, heavy not with leaves, but with silence. The window did not open, and yet the smell of moss crept through its edges. Looking through it felt like looking out of someone else's dream, and wondering if it had ever been your own. Few reached this point. Fewer still turned back from it. Most stood still, unsure whether the hallway had led them deeper into the house or out of it entirely, because when they glanced behind, the space had changed. The walls were the same, the wood unchanged, but the feeling was not. What had been a passage now felt like a return. What had led forward now pressed gently behind the ribs, urging a different direction. And when they moved again, the path outside revealed itself, not in light, but in absence. The trees shifted slightly. The wind remembered its rhythm, and beneath their feet, the first stone of the path, silent, waiting, glimmered with recognition. There is something unsettling about walking a path that only becomes visible in hindsight. It demands a kind of faith that has no direction, a surrender to something unseen, unpromised. The path did not ask to be followed. It did not beckon. It merely appeared when you no longer searched. Each step felt both familiar and unearned, as if someone else had once walked this very route and left behind the feeling of having done so. But not the footsteps. In certain places the forest grew quieter, not from lack of sound, but from layers of it, compacted. Leaves still rustled and branches still moaned with age, but everything seemed to happen beneath a layer of muffling, like hearing the world through water. Birds called, but their voices felt delayed, arriving moments after their wings had disappeared from view. Even one's own breath seemed to echo through a body it did not belong to. The forest absorbed identity, gently, gradually, until even your name felt like something borrowed, something once whispered through the trees and then taken back. The path crossed a shallow stream at one point. Not a bridge, not a ford, just stones, flat and dry, placed with the kind of spacing that hinted at intention but not design. The water itself barely moved, as if uncertain whether it wanted to continue. On either side of the stream, reeds swayed in directions opposite the breeze. The sound they made resembled voices, but not language. More like the hushed murmur of decisions never spoken aloud, the kind people make with their backs turned, their eyes downcast, their hands unmoving. It was here, by the stream, that the first signs of memory began to settle into the soil. Not personal memory, deeper than that. Memory of memory, ancestral, archetypal. The feeling of waiting for something you didn't know you'd lost. Of stepping where others had stepped, not because you followed them, but because the earth had bent inward from their passage. The stones remembered. The water paused. And for a moment, the forest did not just surround you. It accepted you. The further the path wandered, the more the world behind it faded, not erased, but dissolved. Familiar images softened at the edges, the shape of a remembered house, the color of a favorite coat. Even the direction of the wind became less certain. It was not forgetting. It was transformation, a quiet recalibration of meaning. What mattered no longer mattered the same way. The forest did not erase the past. It unwound it, turned it into something you could hold differently, not in your hands, but behind your eyes. There was a hill that sloped just enough to make you feel taller at its base, and just enough to make you feel smaller at its peak. The climb was not difficult, but something in the rhythm of the steps pulled at the breath, as if each footfall released a weight you hadn't noticed carrying. At the top, the trees parted, without fanfare, without light, simply moved aside like curtains drawn by an unseen hand, and beyond them stood a single stone arch, weathered, cracked, half buried in earth and ivy. It did not mark a doorway. It marked a decision. No one passed through it and remained unchanged, not visibly, but in the slow shifting of their walk, in the way their shoulders remembered how to carry less, in the silence that stretched longer between thoughts. The arch held no writing, but those who passed beneath it sometimes emerged with a word in their mind, one they did not understand, but could not forget. It echoed not in their ears, but in the places behind questions, behind longing. A word meant not to be spoken, but carried, until it found its meaning. The path beyond the arch curved sharply to the right, always to the right. No matter where you began, the bend always turned that way, and at the bend, always, the light faltered. Not gone, not dimmed, just thoughtful, as if it too had something to remember. In the shadow of the arch and the turn beyond it, the air grew heavy with the scent of earth that had not been disturbed in centuries. Not decay, but preservation. The soil held not the smell of rot, but of rest, like pages unopened for too long. Ferns lined the edge of the path, curling upward as if listening. Some bore spores that shimmered in ways no sunlight explained. Others tilted gently when passed, as if bowing to something older than footsteps. A tree stood here, massive and impossibly symmetrical. Its trunk split into two, but the split was seamless. No violence, no tear, just division as a form of grace. The roots encircled a stone well at its base. The well was dry, but the moss inside was green, thriving, as though watered by something other than rain. Some said this well marked the center of something not measured by distance. Others claimed it was the mouth of a question that had never been asked out loud. If one leaned close enough, they might hear a sound, not water, not wind, but the soft intake of breath. Waiting. The tree did not drop leaves in autumn. It shed memory, slivers of bark that bore impressions, not carvings, but imprints, like a place once touched by thought. If collected, they would crumble in the hand, but if left alone, they sometimes rearranged themselves by morning. Travelers who spent a night near the tree often dreamed of faces they had never met, voices speaking in patterns without words, and when they woke, the path behind them looked newer, as though someone else had walked it again during the night, just to make sure it still remembered how to return. Before the path disappeared again into the thicker trees, it narrowed, not in width, but in certainty. The soil grew smoother. The undergrowth pulled back. It was as though the forest was stepping aside, not to invite, but to allow. The final stretch of this part of the journey had no markers, no landmarks, only sensation. The air held a hum, not a sound, but a pressure just beneath the skin, like a forgotten melody trying to return. The light here was softer than moonlight, and warmer than fire. It clung to the edges of things like memory does to scent. Some called this stretch the quieting, not because the forest fell silent, but because the self did. Thoughts came slower, movements became smaller, even breathing became more deliberate. The body began to move with the rhythm of something larger, something old. People spoke of feeling watched here, but not by eyes, by possibility, as if every step they did not take also walked beside them, in parallel, a shadow made not from light, but from choice. It was near here that the path would begin to fade. Not end, fade, slowly, gently, each stone less distinct, each turn less defined, until finally, there was no path at all. Just the sensation of having walked, just the imprint of decision pressed faintly into the soles of the feet, and behind them only forest, still, familiar, patient. And if one turned, just once at the right moment, then perhaps, only perhaps, they would see it. Not ahead, not beneath, but stretched behind them in perfect silence. Not every path begins in the forest. Some begin far earlier, in moments too quiet to remember, in a pause before a decision, in the hesitation before a word, in the stillness that follows a forgotten name. This one had begun years before its first step was ever taken. It had waited, not as a trail waits to be walked, but as a question waits to be asked. In the space between what had been and what might be, the path had already grown, backward. There was a village once, not far from the forest's edge, where time wore softer shoes. The streets curved gently, not to follow the land, but to follow memory. Houses leaned ever so slightly toward each other, like old friends who'd grown tired of standing alone. Doors remained open longer than necessary. Windows never closed fully. People there did not rush. They lingered. They repeated stories. And in those repetitions, paths were shaped, not across the land, but across minds. In this village lived someone whose name had been worn smooth by time, not erased, but softened, like the edge of a coin passed through too many hands. Their home was the smallest on the edge of the square, with vines that never stopped growing, and a single chair always left just slightly turned toward the west. They never left the village, not really. But now and then, people would see them staring into the tree line, not as if watching, but as if waiting to be watched. They had a habit of walking at dusk, just before the sky forgot what color it was, always the same route, around the square, past the old well, behind the bakery, then pausing at the stone post with no plaque. They would stop, lean slightly, and tilt their head, not in curiosity, but in recognition. as if something passed through them at that moment, a breeze that remembered more than they did. Then they would return home, each time slower than before. Not from age, from something else, something that was quietly retracing them. The villagers spoke gently about them, the way one speaks of someone who is still here, but not quite. Children were told not to follow them, not out of fear, but reverence. As if the steps they took were not for others to mimic. They left no trail, no footprints. But when others passed that same route the next morning, they sometimes felt the urge to pause, just briefly, at the post with no plaque, and sometimes, only sometimes, they'd feel a tug beneath their ribs, a soft turning, a quiet remembering. That was the village's edge, not its border, but its hinge, where life did not end or begin, but looped gently, folding backward, waiting for the path to appear. There was a garden behind the small house, if it could still be called a garden. No fences, no paths, no plan, just a collection of things that grew because they were allowed to. Moss spilled over stone, ivy circled roots in slow conversation, and flowers bloomed in colors that had no names in the village tongue. Some only opened at dusk. Others turned inward at dawn. No one tended them. Yet they were never wild. They were remembered. In the center of the garden stood an old wooden structure, part trellis, part shelter, part memory. Its beams leaned toward each other as though they had once held weight, and now held only the echo of purpose. Beneath it, the ground was bare. No weeds grew, no leaves settled. The earth there seemed recently touched, though no one had stepped there in years. And in the middle, a small, worn circle of stones outlined something that could not be seen, only felt. A boundary, not of space, but of thought. Visitors rarely noticed it, but those who did often paused without knowing why. They would stand on the edge of the circle, shift their weight, and then glance over their shoulder, not toward the house, but toward the trees beyond the village, as if something had called them gently, and then changed its mind. Children especially felt it. They would run toward the garden, only to stop suddenly, mid-step, as though a thread had caught their breath. They never cried, only blinked, turned, and walked back in silence, back in. Those who lived in the village long enough knew better than to ask questions about the circle, not out of fear, but out of respect. Some said it was the imprint of a choice that had never been made. Others believed it marked the place where someone had once turned around and seen the path just once before it faded. Whatever it was, the garden grew around it, tenderly, deliberately, not to conceal, but to frame, to mark the spot where time had once folded inward. And so the garden remained, not a place of beauty, but of balance. A still point in a life otherwise lived in quiet motion, where nothing happened, and yet everything remembered what had. On certain evenings, just before the sky surrendered to stars, the village would go still, not because of silence, but because of listening. Windows remained open longer, lanterns dimmed without being touched. The air grew thicker, not with heat, but with presence, as though something had returned not from afar, but from before. And in those moments, people felt the sensation of being watched, not by eyes, but by their own history. The small house at the edge would glow faintly, though no light inside had been lit. The vines at its base would stir, even without wind. Shadows near its foundation would grow softer, rounder, like echoes that had learned to walk. Sometimes, on these nights, the garden behind the house shimmered faintly, not visibly, only in feeling, like an emotion pressing lightly against the skin, uninvited, but not unwelcome. Those walking past might find their steps slowing, not stopped, only softened. Their thoughts, usually tangled with errands and memory, would drift into stillness. They might remember something they hadn't realized they'd forgotten, a voice, a scent, a decision left unanswered. And then, as quickly as it came, it would fade. The sky would darken fully. The wind would resume its ordinary rhythm. and the house would return to being simply a house. But something had shifted. Something always did. A feeling lodged itself behind the ribs like a step not yet taken, the kind of step that waits, not to be chosen, but to be understood. The path was not in the forest that night. It was in them, and it glimmered quietly, waiting for a future moment of looking back. In the attic of the house, if one could call that narrow space beneath the sloped roof an attic, dust did not settle. It hovered, suspended, in the same layers it had held for years. Light entered only once a day for a brief moment, through a single crack in the wooden seam. When it did, the beam struck a corner where nothing stood, and yet something had clearly stood once. A faint outline on the floor, shaped like a box or a chest, no longer present. There was no ladder to reach the attic, no stairs, but it could be reached, always, by those who didn't intend to, sometimes in sleep, sometimes by accident. You'd find yourself there not knowing how, standing quietly in the narrow space with your hands resting on your sides, not touching anything, not moving. And always, always, you'd know better than to open your mouth. The attic was not a place for sound. It was a place for recognition. The walls bore no writing, but the knots in the wood twisted in ways that felt deliberate. If stared at too long, they began to form shapes, not pictures, not symbols, but moments. A porch swing, a door left open, a breath taken too late, things that never happened, but still remembered themselves. The kind of memories that do not belong to one person, but to everyone who ever almost chose something else. No one stayed long in the attic. Not out of fear, but because it always felt like overstaying, like listening too long at a door not meant for you. Those who returned from it could never describe what they saw, only what they felt. A soft weight in the chest, a pull in the center of the palm, the sense that somewhere far behind them, or perhaps just to the left, there was a path that had been waiting, one they had already walked, one they had not yet seen. Sometimes, when the sky turned silver, not gray, not blue, but that in-between sheen just before rain, the trees near the village would lean closer, not physically but perceptibly, the way thoughts sometimes press against the skull. The forest did not move, but it came nearer. People inside their homes would glance toward the windows without knowing why, and the edge of the square would feel shallower, as if the distance between here and there had quietly collapsed. On such days, the person in the vine-covered house would not walk. They would sit instead, facing the garden, their back straight, hands still, eyes unfocused. Birds did not land on the roof those days. The wind took a slower rhythm. Even the shadows seemed careful. And if one watched long enough, they might notice something in the soil shift. Not visibly, but rhythmically, as if the earth itself were remembering a pattern it had buried long ago. These were the days when the path stirred beneath things, beneath houses, beneath water, beneath silence. Not to rise, but to stretch, testing its own presence, to see if it still remembered how to be followed, if it still knew how to wait. And those sitting near it, those listening, might feel it, a pulse beneath the bones, a map drawn not on paper, but within the movement of thought, a whisper forming just behind the spine. Nothing ever happened on those days, not outwardly. But people noticed themselves reaching for objects they hadn't touched in years, old letters, unsent postcards, coats that had hung too long. They would brush dust off things without knowing why. They would set items down and forget where they placed them, because the path had moved closer, because the path had never left. There is a moment just before the rain begins when the world holds its breath, not in fear, but in anticipation. In that space, the path reveals itself most clearly, not in lines, not in stones, but in alignment, in the way the cracks in a window mirror the veins in a leaf, in the way your heartbeat slows to match the sound of distant thunder, in the way you suddenly remember a face not from life, but from something older than dreams. On that day, as the first drop touched the windowsill, the person in the small house stood, slowly, without reason, without urgency. They walked toward the garden, not down a path, but across it. And the soil did not bend, did not shift. It recognized. Their feet found the edges of things long invisible. And in each step, the garden became something more than a place. It became a passage. No one saw them leave the house. But everyone in the village felt it. A stillness that didn't belong to weather. A quiet that lingered too long. And when the rain began in earnest, the house seemed lighter, less rooted, as if its foundation had let go. People would pass it in the days that followed and pause, not out of grief, but out of recognition. They would glance at the garden. They would feel something move behind their ribs, and then they would walk on, slower, softer, eyes just slightly more inclined to look back, because the path had shifted again, and somewhere, behind them, it had already begun. There was a clearing deeper in the forest where the path never formed, yet always passed through. It did not announce itself, nor did it need to. The trees there bent inward just slightly, not out of age, but deference. The air stood still, not breathless, but watching. Moss clung thicker here, as if unwilling to release the memory of what had once rested beneath it. No birds sang, no insects stirred. Yet the space did not feel empty. It felt full, full of things that had not yet happened, full of moments waiting to be remembered. In the center of the clearing, the ground bore a subtle depression, not a hole, not a grave, just a soft curvature in the soil, like a page folded inward to mark a place in a book. If one stood there long enough, they might feel something beneath their feet. Not movement, not warmth, but recognition. The feeling that this spot had held weight, not of a body, of a decision, and that the decision, long made, had never stopped echoing outward through time. Above the clearing, the sky was always the same, a pale, uncertain silver. Even on clear days, even beneath bright stars, the light here diffused differently. Shadows arrived early and left late, and the colors, what few there were, seemed borrowed from somewhere else. The browns of the bark leaned cooler, the green of the leaves dulled, like a memory softened by repetition. Time bent differently here, not faster, not slower, just aside. Those who wandered into the clearing often forgot why they came. Their steps slowed, their posture softened. Some sat, others stood without shifting weight for what felt like minutes, hours, lifetimes. It wasn't trance. It wasn't fear. It was the kind of stillness that only comes when something inside has begun to listen more than it speaks. They didn't hear voices. They heard spacing, the quiet breath between thoughts, the margin around what had once been important. No markers framed the edges of the space, yet those who left it always knew they had passed through something. They walked differently afterward, not in pace, but in rhythm, as though a part of them now moved to a gentler beat, one rooted not in urgency, but in recollection. Some would turn as they exited, just once, expecting to see the path they had taken in, but nothing was ever there. Just moss, just silence, just the faint impression of a step that had not yet happened, because the clearing was not part of the path. It was the place the path waited for you to realize you'd been walking it all along. There was a stream that touched the edge of the clearing, not a rushing brook, but a thin, deliberate trickle that moved without sound. Its surface barely shimmered. Leaves floated on it, but never drifted far. They seemed to pause, suspended in an in-between. The water came from nowhere. It did not begin at a spring or a fall. It simply arrived, already mid-journey, then disappeared beneath a shelf of earth no one ever dared to peer behind. It wasn't hidden. It was just quietly excused from attention. Stones lined its shallow bed, arranged in no order yet strangely even. They were flat, smooth, colorless in sunlight but tinged with hues in shadow, sometimes blue, sometimes rust, sometimes the pale yellow of old letters. People who stepped near the stream often found themselves placing one foot onto a stone without knowing why. Then another, then another. They did not cross it. They just stood, one foot still on moss, the other balanced on silence. A pause, given shape. No animals came to drink. No insects skimmed the surface. And yet the stream never dried. It did not serve life the way water usually does. It served remembrance. There was a rhythm to the stream, not in its sound, but in its stillness, a kind of hush that slowed the breath, quieted the mind, and brought forward a memory not yours, but familiar, as if something inside you was being returned, gently, without explanation. Sometimes in certain lights, there appeared to be steps beneath the water, not carved, not built, just deeper segments of stone aligned too perfectly to be chance. They led away from the clearing, not forward, not back, but down. No one followed them, not because they feared what lay below, but because they knew. The path only revealed its descent when it no longer needed to be walked. The stream offered a reflection not of what was above it, but of what had once waited beneath. Beyond the clearing, the forest changed, not in trees or undergrowth, but in how space itself arranged. The distances between things became less consistent. A tree that looked near might take minutes to reach. A root that seemed far away might catch your foot before your next step. Time did not pass normally here. It pooled, it eddied, it curved back on itself in subtle spirals. You might find yourself standing in the same spot you passed moments ago, only now it felt older, or newer, or unfinished. The air carried no scent, but the breath tasted of ash and rain, not acrid, not fresh, just remembered. Sounds were quieter now, not because they faded, but because they waited. A snapped twig did not echo right away. A cough took longer to return to your ears. The world seemed to be considering whether it would acknowledge your presence at all. And still, the path continued. Not seen, but known. Each step was less a movement and more a recognition. You were not going forward. You were becoming aware of having already gone. The trees here bore carvings, but not of symbols or initials. Their bark held the gentle, recursive grooves of eyes, not drawn, not literal, just the shape of being seen. And when the wind moved through them, it made no rustle. It made a sound like the exhale of someone who had stopped searching, a sound that did not begin or end, but remained. Those who passed through this part of the forest often forgot they were walking. Their legs moved, but their thoughts lingered behind, or ahead, or beside. Time no longer walked with them. It drifted, curious, unanchored. This was the place where the path lost form entirely. And yet, no one ever felt lost. At the heart of the forest, where the canopy grew too thick for sky to interfere, stood a circle of stones so worn by time that they no longer felt like stone. They were warm to the touch, not heated, just long held. The circle was too even to be natural, too incomplete to be constructed. One of the stones always leaned out, as if listening to the others. Another sat lower than the rest, its surface indented, like it had once borne weight, and still remembered how it felt. No one built it. No one claimed it. Yet everyone who found it knew what it was, a place of decision. Not the moment a choice is made, but the moment before it. The pause between inhale and answer. The breath just before a hand releases or holds tighter. Standing within the circle felt like standing within a question, one that had no words, only pressure, only invitation. The air here hummed, not with sound but with density, a pulse that matched the beat beneath your sternum. The longer you stood within the circle, the more you sensed yourself being arranged, not from the outside, but from memory, as if the shape of who you were was being gently realigned to match the shape of someone you had once almost been. And somewhere within that alignment, the path reemerged, not as direction, but as understanding. Not where to go, but what had already brought you here. Most stepped out quickly. Some lingered, A rare few knelt, touched the indented stone, and closed their eyes, not to pray, not to ask, but to echo. And when they rose, they did not walk away. They turned, slowly, and began to return, not toward something, away from something that had just become clear. There was a cabin, long decayed, deeper than most dared wander. It had once stood proudly, square and certain, its beams thick with the confidence of purpose. Now it sagged gently into the earth, its corners bowed by time's patience. Ivy slipped through its seams. The windows, long without glass, framed only shadows. And yet, the cabin felt more present than any place before it, as if its collapse had made it more real. Inside, the air did not move. Dust rested in perfect stillness, undisturbed even by light. Objects remained, not as relics, but as listeners. A chair with one missing leg, balanced against the wall. A shelf with a single, unreadable book. A tin cup, still catching the drip of a roof leak that no longer existed. The room bore the hush of a sentence never finished, of someone who had once meant to come back. On the far wall hung a frame. It held no picture, only cloth, faded, stained, but carefully stretched. Some believed it once held a map. Others thought it was a piece of clothing from a journey that never began. Whatever it was, it absorbed attention. Not demanded it, absorbed it. Staring at it too long made the rest of the room dim, made your breath feel shallower, as though the fabric was not showing you something, but taking something back. No one stayed long in the cabin, not because of fear, because they felt finished, as if whatever had brought them this far had already unfolded. The cabin was not a place of rest, it was a place of return. You left it not with answers, but with fewer questions. And when you stepped outside again, the forest had changed, not around you, but through you. The path was behind, the path was ahead, the path was within. In the quiet that followed the cabin, the forest softened. The light grew warmer, more forgiving. The wind regained its voice, rustling leaves in phrases no longer sharp with memory, but softened by passage. The moss thickened, the ground leveled. It felt as if the world had exhaled, finally, fully. And in that exhale, the path began to disappear again. Not suddenly, not cruelly, but gently, like a thought slipping out of reach just after being understood. The traveler would walk, and begin to realize they were no longer being guided. No more landmarks, no more shifts in air, just footsteps that sounded like their own. And then came the moment, quiet, undramatic, when they turned. Behind them the path glowed, just faintly, not in light, in meaning. It had always been there, from the garden, the stream, the circle of stones, the cabin, all of it. One single folded line drawn slowly through time, now visible only because they had chosen to look back. And in that moment they knew. This was not where the path ended. This was where they realized it had already begun. The path did not end with silence. It ended with sound, soft, distant, incomplete. Not a melody, not a rhythm, but the beginning of both. As though something had started to sing long ago and then paused, waiting for someone else to remember the words. The sound did not reach the ears. It touched the skin, the spaces behind the eyes, the air between bones. It came from nowhere specific, but it felt familiar, like the hum of a forgotten room, or the soft clink of porcelain once held in steady hands. The forest here thinned, not by retreat, but by trust. The trees stepped back, as if offering space without demand. Light filtered in again, not suddenly, but gradually, like water soaking into cloth. Colors regained their voices. The brown of bark grew warmer. The green of leaves deepened. Shadows softened at the edges, no longer holding secrets, but resting quietly beside the truth. The air tasted different here, cleaner, not new, just less burdened. There was a field just beyond, where nothing ever grew taller than the knee. Not because it couldn't, but because it didn't need to. The ground rolled gently, like the rise and fall of breath. In the distance stood a single tree, too symmetrical to be accidental, too solitary to be part of a forest. Its branches spread wide, but did not droop. Its leaves moved, even without wind. The bark bore no marks, and at its base sat a bench carved not from wood, but from something between stone and memory. It held the shape of someone who had once waited, and someone who had once arrived. No one sat there now. But the bench remembered. Its surface curved in the right places. Its foundation rested with the weight of stories that had already happened, and the grass around it bent, not downward, but toward, as if even the blades of green had chosen to lean in just slightly to listen. Standing in this space, the path no longer mattered, not because it was forgotten, but because it had finally been understood. It had never led to this field. It had always led through it. The journey was not toward the tree, or the bench, or the field. The journey was the act of recognizing that they had always been here, waiting for you to see what had already been seen. And as the sound faded, gently, gratefully, it left behind no echo, only breath, only stillness, only the quiet curve of a story that had folded into itself, perfectly. The bench did not offer rest. It offered recognition. Those who approached it often paused, then changed their mind, then sat anyway. The act of sitting felt final, not in the sense of endings, but of confirmations. It felt as though you were not the first to arrive, but the last, as if everyone else had already been here and left their absence behind. And that absence now made space for you, not to replace them, but to complete something unfinished. The tree above offered no shelter from rain and no shade from sun, and yet it held the sky together. Its branches did not tremble. Its roots did not dig. It simply was. A marker, not of location, but of rhythm. If you listened carefully, you could feel the seasons folding inward around it, not cycling, not spinning, settling, a spiral drawn inward, like breath after speech. Beneath it, time did not pass. It assembled. Some travelers brought with them things they had not meant to carry, letters never sent, stones with no names, keys that no longer opened anything. And when they sat, these things grew heavier, then lighter, then disappeared, not physically, but from the need to hold them. The bench did not take burdens. It simply allowed them to rest beside you, quietly, until they no longer needed to be named. And always, after a time, there would come a moment, subtle, nearly missed, when the traveler would turn their head. Not deliberately, almost shyly, and behind them the path would shimmer. Not in light, but in meaning. A line drawn through the forest, the cabin, the stones, the clearing, the village. A line that did not lead to the tree. A line that had begun long before it ever became visible. The path was not a direction. It was a memory. Somewhere far beyond the tree, though not far in miles, stood a wall. It was not tall, not imposing. It bore no carvings, no cracks, no door. It simply stretched in both directions until the trees claimed it. Its surface was made of stone, but not quarried stone. Stone that had gathered, smoothed, stacked, settled by time itself. It looked as though it had once been part of something larger, but had chosen to remain alone. Travelers rarely reached it, not because it was hidden, but because it did not need to be found. It revealed itself only when you no longer sought what was beyond it, when questions grew quiet, when movement became stillness. That was when the wall emerged, not as an obstacle, but as a mirror. Standing before it, most realized they had no desire to pass through. The wall offered nothing, promised nothing. It simply was. And in its presence, something loosened inside. The need to go farther, the urge to understand, the ache to arrive. All of it fell away like dust in wind. The wall was not the end of the path. It was the end of searching. A few would reach out to touch it. Their fingers would press gently against its surface and feel nothing. Not cold, not warmth, just the absence of resistance, like touching silence, like meeting the final sentence of a book you had not realized was your own. And when they turned back, the world had not changed. But they had, because the path that ends before it begins always begins where questions end. Beyond the wall, for those few who continued, the forest returned. But it was not the same. The trees no longer stood with quiet weight. They moved, not visibly, but in presence. They no longer loomed. They welcomed. The path here was clearer, not because it had been laid, but because it had been lived. Each step felt like returning to somewhere you had never been, but had always known. The ground bore the softness of many feet, though no prints remained. The air carried warmth, though no sun broke the canopy. You could smell things here, not flowers or leaves, but memories. Fresh bread, firewood, rain on canvas. The world whispered in scents rather than sound, and every scent said the same thing. You are not lost. At intervals along the path were objects, simple, ordinary, misplaced. A coat hung on a branch, a teacup resting on a stump, a pair of shoes neatly side by side, laced but unworn. They did not belong to the traveler, but they felt familiar. Not relics, not signs, just remnants of lives parallel to your own, now set gently aside. You did not touch them, you only noticed, and noticing was enough. For in this part of the path, you no longer sought to walk. You simply followed the sensation of being where you had already been. And for the first time, your steps made no sound. Not because the forest hushed them, but because you no longer needed to hear yourself move forward to know you were not standing still. Eventually, the forest opened to a place that did not feel like land. There were no trees, no grass, only smooth, undisturbed earth, pale and even. It did not shine, but it glowed, faintly, as if lit from beneath by stories buried so long ago that only silence remained. The air here felt thinner, yet more alive. It wrapped around you like a garment too light to see, not warm, not cool, just known. In the center of this space was a circle, not marked by stone but by difference. The soil changed tone, just enough to be noticed. Standing inside it, there was no view. The horizon fell away. The sky, though present, offered no direction. You could not see the forest anymore. You could not see the path. You could only feel the weight of having arrived. Not somewhere, but somewhen. Here, people often wept, not out of sorrow, out of recognition, of themselves, of others, of something older than either. The body reacted first, a tremble, a sigh, a stilling of the chest. Then came the thought, not loud, not new. I've been here before. Though the mind could not place it, the breath remembered, the spine remembered, the quiet beneath memory remembered. And after standing in that place, no one walked away. They drifted, softly, as though their weight had been halved, as though the air had taken back something it once lent. The circle did not change, but those who stepped out of it no longer looked at the world the same, because they had finally seen the path from the other side. In the end, the path was never meant to be walked from beginning to end. It was not a road. It was a realization, a long, patient unfolding, a question that answered itself not with explanation, but with memory. Its shape could not be drawn on a map, but only in reflection. It could not be spoken of while being followed, only when one had turned and looked and seen where they had been, without knowing when they started. The path did not change you. It reminded you of pauses taken seriously, of moments overlooked, of choices made in silence that echoed louder than words. It showed you the weight of each breath, the grace in each step, the truth in each shadow. And when you left it, if one could ever truly leave, you carried none of it with you. And yet you were never again without it. Some paths begin when the foot first touches ground. Others begin when the eye first sees the road ahead. But this one began the moment you realized you had already walked it, that it had been with you, in glimpses, in hesitations, in the gentle tug beneath the heart, long before you ever called it a path. And even now, as you read these final lines, you may feel it again. Not in the words, not in the thought, but in the space between both. That is where it lives. That is where it ends. That is where it begins. There are places that exist not in geography, but in gravity, not measured by coordinates, but by the quiet pull they exert on memory. The final stretch of the path was one such place. It did not appear at the edge of a map or at the mouth of a valley. It appeared where return became impossible, not because of distance, but because of understanding. You could never go back to not knowing the path had been there all along. That was its final act, not to lead you farther, but to hold you still and let you see. Here, the air was thinner, but not for lack of oxygen. It was thinner, in the way silence becomes thinner after grief, fragile, suspended, expectant. The trees, now fewer, stood farther apart. They did not guard. They did not guide. They simply witnessed. Their trunks bore no markings, yet you felt as though they had recorded every thought you had not spoken, every glance you had turned away from, every weight you had carried without knowing. The ground was soft beneath your feet, yet firm. You no longer doubted each step. You no longer questioned your direction, because direction no longer mattered. You were not headed toward. You were becoming aware. Each motion was not progress, it was remembrance. Each breath not effort, but return, not to a place, not to a self, to something older than either, something that had waited inside you, quiet and faithful, through all the noise of becoming. You noticed things differently here. A leaf did not simply fall, it chose to descend. A breeze did not pass, it greeted. Even your shadow, if it still followed, seemed to do so more gently. It no longer mirrored. It walked beside you. No longer an echo of light, but a companion of movement. No longer trailing, no longer pulling, just present. And as you walked, something began to unfold. Not ahead, not behind, but within. A slow, spacious awareness, not insight, not revelation, just the opening of a door you didn't know you had closed. There was no vision, no voice, only a pause. And in that pause, the truth. The path had never been a place. It had always been the act of turning. There is a moment, unnoticed in its arrival, irreversible in its passing, when you stop moving and realize you already have. Not your body, but something older, something that had begun walking long before your first breath and now stood, quietly, with you. That moment did not come with signs or symbols. It came with stillness, a stillness that did not require you to stop, only to listen. In this final part of the path, the world lost its edges, distances softened, sounds no longer announced their sources. Everything felt close. A bird's call could have come from the branches above, or from inside your chest. The rustle of leaves could have been your own breath. The ground beneath you was no longer forest or soil or stone. It was presence. Not a surface to step on, but a space that remembered you. Some travelers closed their eyes here, not to block out the world, but because the world had already turned inward. Their thoughts no longer followed the old lines. They curved differently now, folding backward like paper reused, like a path retraced. Names became less important. So did memories. Not because they were lost, but because they had finally been folded into something quieter than identity, something deeper than story. You could feel it most clearly in your fingertips, not tingling, not cold, just recognition. The sense that you had once held something here, someone's hand perhaps, or a moment too fleeting to stay. That sensation lingered, not to pull you back, but to remind you. Not everything that ends disappears. Some things remain simply by becoming part of what moves forward. And in that moment, you did not ask where the path would lead. You did not ask what waited at the end. You understood. It had always waited here. There was a hill, gentle and low, near the final breath of the path. It did not rise so much as gather, a slow lifting of land, as if the earth had taken a deep inhale and held it, not out of tension, but out of quiet. Climbing it was not effort, it was release. Each step loosened something beneath your ribs. Each pause seemed to ripple gently outward, as though your presence echoed long before your arrival. At the top, there was no view. The forest was gone from sight. The trees stood behind you now, not distant, not diminished, but complete. Before you stretched a field of nothingness, not void, not emptiness. Just completion. The light here had no direction. It glowed equally from all sides, bathing the air in the kind of softness usually found only in dreams, or in childhood, or in the pause between apology and forgiveness. No one spoke here, not because there was silence, but because there was no need. Words had served their purpose elsewhere. Here, the language was movement, slow, intentional, woven from breath and presence. Some knelt, some stood still, some laid down, not to sleep, but to listen. And what they heard was not sound, but settling, the gentle realignment of everything that had once been out of place. It was said that this hill was not part of the path, but the place the path had always been pointing toward, not to reach, but to remember, to feel, even if only for a moment, what it meant to arrive. And from that point, there was no farther to go, not because the journey had ended, but because the question had been answered, not in words, not in knowledge, but in stillness. And stillness, finally, became home. Time behaved differently here, not slower, not faster, but honest. It did not count. It did not warn. It simply allowed things to breathe, to fade, to remain. The wind, when it came, did not pass through. It stayed. It curled gently around the ankles, lingered at the fingertips, settled into the creases of clothing as though it, too, had been waiting for this moment of unhurried presence. The shadows had softened into suggestion. They no longer marked hours. They marked depth, the curve of a shoulder, the hollow of a neck, the bend of a branch. Each cast not a darkness, but a continuation. Light and shadow were no longer opposites here. They had reconciled. They folded into one another like questions and answers told in the same breath. Some travelers wrote things down here, though no one asked them to. They would find in their hands paper they did not bring, a pen or a piece of charcoal or a fingertip dipped in soft earth. What they wrote never lasted. It disappeared moments later, taken back by soil or air or time, and yet the act mattered. It was not for remembering, it was for releasing. A final tracing of thought before letting thought rest. And when the writing vanished, they did not mourn. They simply smiled, not with lips, but with posture, with stillness. And they turned, not away, not back, but inward. The path, having been walked, no longer needed to be followed. It remained not as direction, but as shape, not as road, but as rhythm. And in that rhythm, they stayed, even as they continued, because some journeys are never left behind. They simply become part of how we move through the world. Eventually, all things soften, even memory, even longing. The path knew this, and so it did not demand closure. It allowed drift. It allowed release. It allowed the traveler to begin forgetting, just enough to move on, never enough to truly leave. And in that forgetting, something gentler emerged. Not detachment, but transformation. Those who left the hill did so quietly. Their steps did not echo. Their footprints did not remain. But the land remembered them, not as interruption, but as inclusion. A bend in the grass, a pause in the breeze, a warmth in the soil that would linger for just a while longer. And the path, though no longer visible, would hum gently behind them, a song no longer needed, but still sung. Back in the world, they would find themselves changed in ways they couldn't explain. They would pause more often, not from fatigue, but from awareness. They would hold objects longer before setting them down. They would speak with fewer words, listen with more space. The world had not changed, but they had begun to inhabit it differently. They would think of the path, not daily, not clearly, but in flashes, in quiet, in dusk, when a shadow fell, just so, when a breeze moved without wind, when a decision formed in silence. And in those moments, they would feel it again. That turn, that recognition, that glimpse just over the shoulder of something that had always been there, patiently waiting to be noticed. And though they would not say it out loud, some would begin to understand. The path was not something they walked. It was something they became. And so, the story folds, not with an ending, not with a beginning, but with a return, not to where it started, but to where it was always going, back into the quiet from which it rose, back into the breath that carried it, back into the pause between the steps that revealed it. The path that ends before it begins does not ask to be followed again. It asks only to be carried, in thought, in silence, in the way we linger before turning around. You will not find it on maps. You will not speak of it at length. But sometimes, without realizing, you will pause at the edge of a moment and feel the air shift. You will notice something in the corner of your vision, a shape, a shimmer, a weight. You will turn, not quickly, not in fear, but with the soft certainty of someone who knows that the world behind them matters just as much as the world ahead. And in that turning, you will see it. The line, the rhythm, the answer drawn across time. You will not walk it again. You will already be walking it, and it will walk with you, always.